Hello, I wanted to address an issue I've seen a couple of people have where they talk about with any carry that has ruck straps that they have an issue with the bottom rail falling off their shoulder. There's a couple different methods for dealing with this, and I wanted to talk about all of them and what each method is good at and the downsides to each method. The first method that I want to talk about is honestly my least favorite, and that's why I want to address it first, because I see a lot of people, especially new wrappers, do this because it's kind of a quick fix, is they twist the ruck straps. And sometimes it'll just be one twist, but I see lots of people that will twist it several times. From a strength standpoint, this is very effective at keeping a ruck strap from sliding off your shoulder. The problem being that, one, this twists into almost a rope, which creates a very, very sharp pressure point. Instead of spreading out evenly over the top of your shoulder and over the front of your arm, it becomes ropey is the term often used. And as baby gets heavier, it gets a lot more painful, even beyond just the regular shoulder heaviness of a ruck. The other issue that I see with this occasionally is that when you start with the seat well tightened, people will have a nice seat, and for some reason when they twist, it creates some weird pull on the individual strands. It changes how the individual strands are tightened. And I've seen this either kind of collapse a poorly made seat, or it can actually over tighten the bottom rail and kind of dig into baby's knees a little bit. So that's the most common method that I see with new wrappers that I'm not a big fan of. The first method that I typically recommend that people try, which is the last method they generally think of trying, is just strand by strand tightening. Because oftentimes that bottom rail slipping off the shoulder comes from uneven tightening across all the strands. The bottom rail is literally just looser than the other strands, and so it's loose and it just flops around wherever it wants. And some of this comes from the myth that if you over tighten the bottom rail, you will pop the seat, which is only true. The only time tightening the bottom rail pops the seat is if baby's not in a supported seated position. And you can over tighten the bottom rail still and create a too deep seat that's not comfortable, but it's not a risk of popping the seat. Generally, I see more under tightened bottom rails than I see over tightened. So the whole idea is you want to support baby in the correct position and then tighten the bottom rail just enough that it's supporting baby in the same position that your hand under their bum is supporting them in. So when you take that hand away, baby's knee has the same amount of support as it did when you were holding it. But when you're initially making the seat, you're typically only dealing with the top and bottom rails. The top rail is keeping baby up and supporting their back, and the bottom rail is supporting their knees. And you don't do a lot with the middle. And so after you make the seat, before you do that next pass, that's when you would do strand by strand tightening all the way across the width, in which you are trying to make sure that every strand over your shoulder is tightened to the same amount. This is both tightening the strands along baby's bum, but it's also tightening the strands that are going to be going over your shoulder and across the front under your armpit, and making sure that no one strand is tighter than the other and no one strand is looser than the other. And I always recommend people try this first before they move on to any kind of sandwiching, because for a lot of people, this is the primary issue, is just uneven tightening, and this is a skill that will translate well into other carries and add to comfort and even tightening. So a lot of times, just making sure that each ruck strap is evenly strand by strand tightened will fix a lot of the issues with the bottom rail sliding off your shoulder because it's under enough pressure from baby's weight, it's keeping it in place. That said, I don't have the narrowest shoulders. I don't have sloping shoulders. I'm fairly broad shouldered. And so that does work to my advantage. And there are people whose build, whether it's sloping shoulders, rounder shoulders, sloping, narrow, whatever, your body shape can play a role in this. And so for some people, sandwiching really does help. And there's two different schools of thought, probably more than that, but two main schools of thought when it comes to sandwiching, and they work very differently. And so the first one is mainly how I see WrapYouInLove and a couple other people sandwich. And in this method, it's right after you make the seat. So you've just got the top and bottom rails tightened. You haven't done any strand by strand tightening. WrapYouInLove and some other channels tend to, often as part of tightening the bottom rail when they're making the seat, bring the bottom rail underneath the whole ruck strap towards their neck, and they kind of use that as a tightening technique. And they put the two rails together, so the top and bottom rail are together right by your neck, and the whole ruck strap is folded in half now, with the top rail on top, bottom rail on the bottom. And what you end up doing when you strand by strand tighten is you're strand by strand tightening 2 layers at a time. So I'm strand by strand tightening the top and bottom rail together, and then I'm grabbing the next strand. I've actually got 2 layers of wrap. I've got 4 inches from the top rail and 4 inches from the bottom rail together that I'm tightening, and then a few inches further down, and then just the middle where it's folded. And then they do the next pass and it's tightened. And that works well for some people. And if it does, that's fine. For me, I find I like being able to tighten each strand individually, because sometimes you might end up with, 3 inches from the top rail on the top layer needs a lot more tightening than the 3 inches from the bottom rail does. And so you end up under tightening one layer and over tightening the other. It's a little less even, gives you a little less control. And I find that sometimes sandwiching that bottom rail at the very beginning puts a little extra pressure on that seat, which means it can either over tighten the seat and dig it a little bit into baby's knees, make them a little less comfortable in the seat, a little too deep, or if you're not supporting baby's knees when you do it, it can pop the seat because baby's knees are falling lower and it's just sliding back up their bum. If it works for you, it's fine. It's not my favorite method, but there is definitely an element of find what works for you. Try all of these. And so the last method, I don't sandwich very often, but when I do, this is how I do it. So we're going back to just made the seat, top rail, bottom rail tightened, no strand by strand tightening done yet. And so this method of tightening, you start by strand tightening from the top rail. Do a few inches over, a few inches over, and I'm just going to strand by strand tighten all the way across until I have maybe 3/4, most 80% of the wrap from the top rail strand by strand tightened. Everything except for the last 3 or 4 inches of the bottom rail. And then I'm going to take this last couple inches and fold that underneath. What this does is it's still folding the bottom rail under to keep it from sliding out, putting extra pressure, but it allows you to tighten the strands individually, gives you a little more control, and that you may notice this more in thicker wraps. I feel it a little less in this wrap, but in a more bulky wrap, you might notice that in the first method of sandwiching, you end up with both layers are kind of pleated or bunched. So you have 2 layers of bunching. And in this method, your top layer of the ruck strap, where you strand by strand tighten, is all bunched up or pleated. And then you have a smooth layer underneath. So it's going to sit a little flatter on your shoulder. And there's some people who are never going to be able to feel the difference. Their shoulders are just not a sensitive area for them, or that particular kind of pressure is not what is sensitive for them. And in which case, that's fine. But some people might appreciate the difference between the two styles. So that's how I prefer to sandwich, if I do at all. And the last method is reverse sandwiching. To me, this is, you got to the end and now you're having a problem and now you kind of need to just rig something to fix it. But some people do it on purpose. And that's strand by strand tighten, like normal, no sandwiching. I'm gonna do that bunched pass, strand by strand tighten the other side, do bunch pass, tie off. So if you strand by strand tighten and you still find that you're having the bottom rail sliding off and you've already got a completed carry and you're like, I'm not gonna undo this whole thing just to redo my ruck straps, you can take this bottom rail and just fold it up on top. This is a reverse sandwich. Fold the bottom rail up on top of the ruck strap towards your neck. It's a lot less secure because nothing's really holding this in place, but it's something to do with that extra slack and gives you a functional carry to keep doing what you're doing, because I recognize that not every wrap job is going to be a perfect wrap job, and sometimes you have to just find a way to make it work for the rest of whatever you were trying to do, and then try something different next time. So I hope those different methods kind of made you think about how you tighten your ruck straps. They're all methods you can try out, go through all of them, see what works for you, and know that what works for you now and what works for you a year from now might be something totally different. So just kind of keep it in the back of your mind. If the ruck straps start to feel diggy or uncomfortable, try something different. Try a different method and see if it works any differently for you. Hope that helped out.